Welcome to the 24th meeting in 2013 of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. Could I please just remind everyone present to please turn off any mobile phones, tablets or other electronic devices. We have received apologies from Gavin Brown, who will be running slightly late this morning. The first item on our agenda today is to decide whether to take item 3 in private. Are members agreed? Yes. Members have indicated their agreement. Our second item of business today is to take oral evidence from members of the David Hume Institute and a round-table format as part of the committee's scrutiny of the draft budget 2014-15. Can I therefore welcome to the meeting Professor Joe Armstrong, Robert Black, Stephen Boyle, Donald MacRae, Jim McCormick and Jeremy Peat. The session will address 4 key questions from the call for evidence on the draft budget as set out in the paper from the clerk. I intend to allow around 20 to 25 minutes for each topic. And if you wish to speak, please indicate to me, the clerk. Now, I'm sure you all know the round table format. People aren't restricted to speaking once or twice. You can come in just as you're seen and speak as often as you so wish. I'd now like to invite Jim McCormick to address the first question, which is on the progress which the Scottish Government is making in meeting its targets as set out in the National Performance Framework. Jim.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to join you in this format today. I think you'll see from the papers that have been submitted by the members of this group some common themes in trying to answer this first question. A genuine answer to the question, are we making progress? Is government making progress? I think would depend upon at least 2 things that we don't have yet. One of them is much clearer links between the priority setting and resource allocation decisions that are made by government and its partners in contributing towards targets and outcomes. So making clear those links. And secondly, showing the strength of the evidence base. So to what extent do our policy choices in Scotland build upon what we know about what works? Are we investing where the evidence is strong? And we aren't really able to answer those questions to the level of accuracy we might like to. So to answer this question at the moment, I think we're doing it within the limits of, on the face of it, what does the performance framework tell us? Even though we may have some questions to ask about the how and the why of what it tells us. So just some points to open with. The targets are, of course, for the whole of Scotland, not just Scottish Government. So I think we would frame the question in terms of the sum contribution being made by all public agencies, as well as by business in the third sector. And there's some reference in the paperwork to the way in which the NHS, through its HEAT targets, has been trying to get more closer to the links between decision-making, spending and outcomes. So there may be some interesting consequences that flow from what the NHS is doing to what other public agencies might do. I think the reason why it is hard to tell how much progress we're making, despite the many strengths of this framework, is partly because the purpose targets are measuring progress and measuring what they're trying to get at in different ways. Let me give an example. So on participation in our labour markets, we're benchmarking Scotland's performance against the rest of the UK and the OECD. So that's an outward-looking, ambitious measure of how we're doing. It is only the employment rate we're measuring, but nonetheless, it's an outward-looking, ambitious measure. When we come to population, though, as an example, and when we look at healthy life expectancy, that's looking at the change measured over a decade. So the improvement in healthy life expectancy over the decade. It's not looking at Scotland in a benchmarking sense. So it's not comparing us to the rest of the UK or to the rest of the OECD. So we have different types of measures going on here, which we can take a view on whether they're ambitious enough, but they aren't. They're not really doing the same thing. And on that population measure, I think it really matters because although Scotland's health performance has improved since the start of devolution, we're still lagging behind comparable parts of the UK, like the north of England. So I think it does matter to be outward looking on that kind of measure as well. On the kind of snapshots we might take, so if a layperson was looking at this framework and trying to ask themselves, are we making progress? I think we can discern more information by scratching the surface than the framework tells us at a glance. So if we take a step back and look at what's the story of the national outcomes, the 16 outcomes, it is possible to drill down and look at the indicators that are mapped against them, and that tells quite an interesting story. First of all, on the indicators, as of now, I think they tell us that we're seeing improvement in 21 of the indicators. We're stable or flatlining on 19 of them and 10 of them going in the wrong direction. That's net progress on 11 indicators. Now, in one measure at a time of recession and austerity, that could be considered as a pretty solid performance. But what we can't tell very easily from the framework is whether that net progress is better than a year ago, is better than 5 years ago. And so our ability to, in the round, ask the question, are we making progress? You have to do quite a lot of digging and a bit of detective work to try and answer that question. And much of what we need is there. Much of the building blocks, many of them are in this performance framework. But it could be made easier, I think, to be able to draw out these kind of conclusions. So in sum, I think the National Performance Framework is a genuine asset for policy making in Scotland and also in terms of accountability. When this committee and others have asked the question, how can we make it more transparent? I think it's about being able to draw clearer the links between the contributions being made by different parts of the public realm in Scotland and the outcomes we are seeing. So, for example, which of our policies in Scotland make a great deal of difference to these outcomes in a positive sense? Which of them don't make much difference at all? And frankly, at a time of a great deal of pressure on our budgets, should we stop doing them or do less of them? We need to be able to answer those kind of questions to get closer to knowing how do we make progress and how do we make our limited public resources make more of a dent in the kind of issues that we all are interested in. A final point, and specifically on some of the indicators. I think you've seen in the paperwork that there's a view that some of these measures at this point in our development probably matter more than others. We can take a view on which they are. But a couple of the indicators that I think we might regard as flashing red because of their wider significance, just two of them. One on emergency hospital admissions, which are continuing to rise. They're up 3% since 6 or 7 years ago. Why does that matter? Because of the costs involved, and because they are at the far end of the spectrum in terms of what we're trying to do on prevention. So we may ask ourselves the question, is what we're doing on reshaping care for older people strong enough, fast enough, being delivered with the right degree of urgency to see that kind of indicator start to go in the right direction? And then a second one I would just end with, supply of new housing, which has gone down significantly. When we know that the Scottish population is rising, that's good news. It's risen to its highest level on record. So it is concerning, to say the least, that our record on supply of new housing is going so steeply in the wrong direction. It also has big knock-on effects for the economy and employment and investment and so on. And so we might ask ourselves questions, harder questions about particular indicators where we have strong evidence about multiplier effects and where we ought to be more concerned if performance is going in the wrong direction than perhaps with some other indicators.
Hey Jim, I'm just going to just say one other thing about your paper, and folk can come in as they so wish. You talk also about local discretion rather than delivery of a national strategy is a more dominant theme in Scotland's annual reporting than in other countries, and there is a risk that local priority setting and resource allocation won't be based consistently on the best available evidence of what works in reducing child poverty.
So the paper prepared, it really takes one policy challenge, which is the challenge of reducing child poverty. We could have taken any others. And it tries to track through what we know about the evidence, what we know about measurement frameworks, what we know about national strategies. And again, the story is one of a decent story on performance in recent years. But if you look at single outcome agreements at the moment, you won't find very many references at all to that national strategy. You won't find many references to the evidence base and what we know about works. I think if we were to characterise where we are with devolution, we are strong on analysis of that kind of problem, but rather weak on investing in what works. And I think for that kind of measure, that kind of challenge of reducing child poverty, well, we know we're on the cusp of another big rise in child poverty, driven by what we might call externalities, in this case, the downside of UK welfare reform. I think we need to be satisfying ourselves that we are maximising, within the limits of current powers and resources, maximising all we can do at both national and local level to drive down the impact of that kind of problem. And I'm not sure we can satisfy ourselves that we're doing it yet.
Malcolm.
It was really just on that point. I was interested in that example and the general point you were making about evidence. I'm just wondering, is that the key thing, that if you localise it in that way, you're less likely to base it on evidence? I mean, I don't suppose that's necessarily so in principle. It assumes the national strategy is evidence and the local strategy isn't. So I wonder about that. But is there a fundamental problem that if so much of the delivery is localised, it's actually very difficult to... Is that consistent with having such strong national targets and objectives, because there's not really any way of ensuring, or any reliable way of ensuring, that the local priorities are going to match up with the national ones?
It's a really good question. I think we see different types of accountability in Scotland across our public services. So what can be achieved through the NHS, for example, through heat targets, and National Dementia Strategy is a great example of what you can achieve by getting alignment between national and local action. It's a bit different from what you can achieve through local government and other community planning partners because of discretion and autonomy. And to some degree, that's right. But I think there's probably a demand at the local level for more support to build know-how, to build the ability and capacity locally to invest in what works. And it's not the case that local action means there's going to be a weaker link to evidence, but I think we could do better at providing support and guidance to local partnerships to make sure that they are putting their limited money into what we know already works better than other actions.
Stephen. Hello there. In your paper, you say one of the committee's questions is whether the national indicators and purpose targets are an effective means of measuring the performance of government. My short answer is yes. I'm just wondering if you can expand on that.
I'm happy to do that, Convener. Thank you. And I'll be fairly brief in that. I want to make 4 points. The first is that I think a virtue of the framework is that it recognises the complexity of government and the world in which government and its agencies operate. Secondly, I think it allows us to measure progress in the round as well as in individual areas of policy. Thirdly, I regard it, and I think it is properly regarded, as being a tool for measurement. It's not a substitute for making judgments about matters of principle or of policy priorities. So it is measuring progress to what has been decided through the democratic process. And finally, echoing, I think, a point which has been made extensively by others, I would agree that if we were looking for enhancements and evolution of the framework, it would be in making clearer the links between aspects of the performance framework and decisions about resource allocation. Not, I would say, that the framework itself should drive those decisions, but it should be clearer when government makes decisions about resource allocation where that relates to aspects of the framework. So those are the points I wanted to make.
John?
Yes, I mean, in your paper you talk about the cost of measuring things, I think. And I mean, I just wonder, I struggle sometimes to get my head around all of this. But for example, we had the example of, I think, 3% increase in hospital admissions. Now, that could be actually good, because maybe it was going to be 10% if we hadn't done anything, and because the government's done all these wonderful things, it's only 3%. So maybe we should be pleased about that. But it shows up as a red light, and it looks on the surface like it's bad. I mean, it just seems to me sometimes you could dig forever into figures like that and maybe never reach a conclusion. And I mean, are we sometimes too, I don't know, optimistic or confident that we really can tie in the pound we spend with this little impact miles down the line? Or is that being cynical?
So I think answer that in 3 ways. First of all, it is very difficult often to trace the linkage between a decision you make and the money that you spend and the ultimate impact, because life's just pretty complicated. So the example that I gave in the paper was what would happen to the supply of maths teachers in Scotland if we trained more maths teachers? Would it go up, would it go down, or would it stay the same? Don't know. Because it would depend what the wages were that would be paid for people with maths degrees in standard life and actuarial firms and so on. So it's difficult. That'd be the first thing. The second is that I think, extending a point that Jim McCormick made, much of the best kinds of evidence that we should seek are around the evaluation of what's going on, to try a bit better to understand the linkages between cause and effect, but also to find out what works. And I would instinctively prefer to spend my last pound on evaluation at the moment than necessarily on measurement. And that takes me to my third point here, which is it can cost a lot of money to measure things. Now, I'm not familiar with the health service measurement system that tells us how many people are being admitted as emergencies. I'm more familiar with a lot of the labour market measurement, and that involves pretty costly surveys. Sometimes it's important to spend that money, but at some point you have to make a judgment about whether having a bit more accuracy is really worth spending the bit more money, because you could spend it somewhere else.
Jamie?
Thanks. Camille, wanted to return to Jim McCormick's paper, and then your paper, Jim, you refer to the fact that governments are well versed in producing targets, milestones, indicators and monitoring frameworks, and you obviously, it's mainly about the Scottish Government's National Performance Framework, but you also talk about the Welsh Government's approach, the Northern Ireland Executive's approach, and you go on to assess their approach and say that each country, and I presume you mean each country of the UK, would benefit from developing the evidence-based underpinning its approach and reporting on evaluation findings and annual progress reports, which I suppose begets the question, you know, to how can we put the National Performance Framework in a wider context. You know, Stephen's just said there that he feels the approach generally is pretty good, but you know, how does it compare to the approach in other jurisdictions, you know, here in the UK, and I think also probably quite interested to know further afield as well.
I think it may be Donald who makes this point in his paper that we're almost at the point where you know, a performance framework is never a profit in its own land. You know, where Scotland Performs is getting more recognition and admiration actually from other parts of the world, including the rest of the UK actually, certainly Wales and Northern Ireland, than maybe the recognition that it gets here at home. I think we are in a sense setting the bar pretty high by saying we would need to know these things in order assess progress. We would need to know about, I guess, showing the inner workings of government more effectively, to show the links between spending decisions and how they link to national outcomes. And I don't think we will ever be in a position to have all the data, all the evidence that would be able to do that across the board. But we might be able to do this in, let's say, half a dozen areas, which might happen to be the 6 priority policy areas that have been agreed with community planning partners in this year's SOA framework. So it may be possible to marshal good enough evidence, good enough linkages around spending decisions and outcomes for those 6 areas. If we were to do that, I think a year from now, 2 years from now, we'd be in a much stronger position than we are today to answer some of your questions. And to me, that would be, to answer your point, that would be us moving from having a very good framework for, as Stephen said, for measuring and for monitoring, to one that is genuinely better at informing local action and practice and priority setting, as well as being able to take a view nationally about how we're doing and what's contributing, crucially, to better outcomes. It's possible that we have some areas where we're doing quite well, like crime reduction, where we just don't know enough about the links. You know, what are the contributing factors? But there are other areas where I think we can tell a stronger story, like on employment, like on education, like on older people's independent living. So I think there are areas where we could be on quite strong ground if we choose to do more around evaluating impact of what works and put more of our investment in those areas, especially at a time of austerity and tight public spending.
But by comparison with other parts of Odin, it'd be interesting to hear others' perspectives. You know, what we have here is actually pretty good.
I think what we have as a framework for measuring and monitoring is probably as good as any of the examples we've seen elsewhere. So, you know, Virginia has spoken about, Oregon has spoken about, British Columbia does this in an interesting way as well. I'm less well versed in European examples, but I think insofar as it goes, the National Performance Framework is as good as any of the examples we've seen.
Michael, to be followed by Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Yesterday at the Welfare Reform Committee, the expert panel on welfare was making the observation that it would be useful to have information which is available nationally through organisations like OBR, broken down to the levels of Scotland as a region. And I was just wondering, you know, the Royal Society of Edinburgh has said that independent assurance of data quality and the matching of data to the measures used in the NPF would be welcome. And I was just wondering what would be the downside of having that, you know, if there are any, because everyone seems to agree that we need this sort of data analysis, but nobody seems to make any arguments as to what would be the downside of that.
Jeremy, you were going to come in next, so that looks perfect timing in terms of responding to Michael's question and putting forward to the point that you were going to make.
Well, thank you, and I should admit to being having chaired the group at the Royal Society of Edinburgh that prepared the response that you've just referred to, Michael, so I can pick that up. I think the point, and it does link up very much to the point that I was going to make. I personally think, having looked at this a bit more than I have done in the past, that the NPF is something that Scotland should be very proud of. I think it is a remarkable achievement to have got something that is so detailed and so regularly presented and so transparent in terms of the data and the targets and the information that's set out there. So I think it's something that is a hugely positive base from which to proceed. I think that the point the RSC has made, I think, is valid, that it would be appropriate just to have the data validated to make sure that everything that's in there has a stamp of approval. And we've referred to Audit Scotland or some other body being engaged potentially in doing that. And I think that's just good governance, to make sure that there is an external look to make sure the data is fine. But I think a more substantive point is, and to pick up what Stephen Boyle says, which is that the data is never, in the end, a replacement for judgment. And I think what one can't hope to achieve is a mechanistic approach whereby you get all the data, you have a sausage machine model into which you insert the data, and you come out with answers as to whether outcomes meet or do not meet Scotland's objectives and what they imply for policies. That doesn't work in that mechanistic way. What you have to have is a sufficiently strong foundation for judgment to be applied, which often has to be related to individual policies, related to individual elements of the objective function of government. So you make sure the data is clean, as crisp, as well presented, as transparent as it can be. And that includes making sure you've got the right comparisons over the right timescale with the right comparator countries or whatever it is. You do all that, but then you need that judgment applied by more detailed analysis, taking the MPF elements as a starting point, but looking more specifically at how outcomes have been determined, how they relate to the objectives that have been set, how policies come in, and what that then means for resource allocation going forward. So I just think this is the starting point rather than the end point, and I think it is a hugely strong starting point for government, for Parliament, and for committees such as this.
Okay. I mean, Robert, the point that Jeremy first kind of made, talking about including mechanisms for independent assurance of data quality and the matching of data. And quite a number of people in their submissions have talked about Audit Scotland's role in that. What do you feel about independent monitoring? How do you feel that NPF could best be monitored? Do you think it's okay the way it is, or should it be independent?
I think from sinusitis a bit this morning. So
apologies, actually, I'm not speaking as loudly as often, but I'm just talking about your view in terms of independent assessment of the data out with the Scottish Government. What's your view on that?
Right. I would very much endorse what Jeremy has just said, and other speakers. I personally am a fan of the Scotland Performance Framework. It's a great start, it's a great foundation, and it's work in progress. But the point about avoiding having a data-driven exercise is really, really important. Kind of flesh this out, but I mean, it's important to give kind of meaning and significance to this, to populate our discussion with some practical examples. We talked a little moment ago about the problem with emergency admissions and so on. And as I think everyone in this committee would recognise, the difficulty is seeing emergency admissions as some kind of stovepipe within the NHS. And over the years, when I was in my former role as the Auditor General of Scotland, we did quite a number of pieces of work that look at whole systems. So back in about 2005-06, we did a really interesting piece of work with the Tayside Health Board and the councils there, which looked at bed blocking and emergency admissions, but related to all the discharge procedures and looked at the blockage in the systems. And we actually kind of analysed it. And surprise, surprise, it doesn't come as a surprise to anyone in this room, issues such as starting the forward planning for discharge as soon as the patient was admitted was really important, and having the community support services there and the right kind of housing environment, particularly for the frail elderly, was important. So you couldn't look at the NHS issue in isolation, just as you can't look at a heat target in isolation. So, to come back to Jeremy's point, you can analyse the data to death, but what really needs to happen is that this committee and other committees in the Parliament are helped to get a good understanding of how the systems are operating out there. And that probably does involve a bit of further work, which could be done by Audit Scotland, could be done by some other entity, to present you with analysis of how the system is operating in the round, rather than being a data-driven exercise. So it will be the next stage in the development of this. It also raises, I'm sorry to speak at length, it's a really important issue, this. It raises another really important issue, which is very closely related to it. If you take the heat targets are owned and run by the Scottish Health Service, you know, and they take ownership of it, and they've developed them really quite well over the last few years. And the Health Service, as this committee knows very well indeed, is roughly speaking about a third of the total spend. It's really, really important. The other big chunk of spend is local government. And the Scottish Government, I think quite rightly in my view, is putting a lot of emphasis upon partnership working. That's right, because it's through partnerships you can actually start analysing the complexity of the systems of delivery at the local level and getting all the joining up done. So there's an issue there about evolving Scotland performs in relationship with the single outcome agreements and what's happening in the partnerships, so that the Parliament can get a good understanding of, let's say, what is happening in the whole social care environment, the community health service in Edinburgh, in Highland and so on. So you get a narrative that actually truly explains what's going on, which is difficult for the committee to do because you're very busy and have got many other commitments. So there is something in there about a really big issue about finding a resource that can help you to analyse and interpret the stuff and present the whole systems picture of what's going on at the locality level.
I mean, Stephen, just go back to your paper following on from that. I mean, you talk about a framework should recognise uncertainty and avoid creating perverse incentives for government. The NPF does this well by avoiding quantified targets and setting specific dates by which they have to be met. So, in a way, you're saying that we shouldn't try and have absolute detailed kind of targets. You know, could you expand a wee bit more on your thinking in this area?
I think for a framework of this nature, which to me tries to look across the whole of government and the whole of the country, it is better to try to set a direction of travel, a broad set of objectives which we're trying to achieve. It's then, I think, perhaps for lower levels of government, individual departments, individual agencies, perhaps to set or have set for themselves more specific targets. One of the reasons I like the framework is that, as I said in the paper, it recognises that there's uncertainty. It recognises, I think, to reflect Jeremy's point, that government is not about sitting in Edinburgh and pulling a lever and action happening in a very predictable way on the ground. Let me give you one example from my own world. My day job is, I work as an economist in a bank. I did not know in 2007 that there was going to be the worst recession on record. I don't think any of us did. If we have frameworks or systems for planning what we do that are wedded very firmly to an expectation about how the world's going to be, we're going to be disappointed, we're going to be let down. So that's why I think you need this kind of flexibility and recognition of uncertainty. Thank
you. Joe, can you talk a wee bit about the linkage between performance information and spending priorities?
Yes, some of this stuff that's come up clearly fits into this section around, do we know when we say we're going to spend the £30 billion, the effect is going to be the positive outcome on the key targets? I think the budget document does talk about the key targets, and I think it's important, certainly from this committee, to be talking about the higher level, longer term targets. It's not the shorter term input or even output measures, it's the outcome measures I think is important. So it's around GDP, it's around productivity, it's around employment. I think it's important we also think about its longer term. So it's always difficult for a one-year budget document to readily identify the impact it's going to have on these longer term, broader macroeconomic measures. But I do think it's difficult at the moment to be able to say with a high degree of certainty that the budget allocations that are made, particularly in times of austerity and the outlook being where funding is going to be not as plentiful as it has been in the last 10 years, that we're now looking at and are allocating the funds as most efficiently, as effectively can to achieve those targets. Now, the targets haven't fundamentally changed. We're still looking at increasing GDP per capita. We're still looking at increasing employment and reducing inequality. So we need to now think through, I think as Jim said at the beginning, are we allocating that as efficiently, as effectively as we can? And I don't think we can actually say that at the moment. So it does come back to, have we got effective evaluation measures that allow us to say, having spent what one might argue is record levels of funding over the last 10 years, do we know which bits have worked? Do we know which bits have not worked? And do we know, probably more importantly, at the margins, where the marginal pound will make the best effect? And I agree, it's not about short-term measures and short-term indicators. It has to be about longer-term runs of data, longer-term runs of evaluation techniques. Some of the quangos are asked to do evaluations. It's not clear to me that some of the departments are carrying out the same level of rigour around their spending. So when they put money into certain initiatives, if the expectation is to improve productivity 4 or 5 years down the track, have they actually delivered? Would you know? Or by just feeding that beast, are you just is marginally diminishing value of returns? I think I wanted to pick up a point I think was made right at the beginning about local versus national. I think you're right about the evidence, what works nationally might be better, because the Scottish data on many areas is better than at the local level, but not perfect. But there are clearly areas where local evidence is much, much more valuable. So I'm thinking around housing. We don't have a Scottish housing market. We have local housing markets. So to be able to identify how to allocate scarce public funding in local housing or social housing, one needs to look at local housing market analyses, not a Scottish market analysis. Now, I think that has been a driving force. So there isn't necessarily a conflict between the national and the local. I think it's relevant to the particular market you're talking about. And I think, for me, the most compelling driver of the most compelling statistic in the National Performance Framework is the one on productivity. If we are talking about growth in GDP and we are talking about reducing inequality, then productivity is the critical factor. And unfortunately, over the last 10 years, we've seen not really a significant change in our relative position in productivity. So it does beg the question, when we do actually ask about where we're allocating our funds and we are making best use of what is now an increasingly scarce resource, how is it affecting productivity? Because we haven't moved from the top of the third quartile in the last 10 years.
Thanks for that. Just a wee further, I'm just wondering what additional evaluation methods we could perhaps introduce to make evaluation more effective and rigorous.
I mean, I think, to me, well, I think there's two elements to this. One is we don't have a model for Scotland. So to be able to say that we can monitor the effects over time on Scottish GDP through our various interventions, we don't have an effective model for that. So one would beg the question, why not? We've got one for the UK. I really do think we do need to have something like that, which would allow us to track over time, not short term. I think we also need to beg the question when we have large interventions, and it's therefore not small budget lines, it's not level 4, it's higher level, to ask the departments or ask the project or budget responsible officer, what was the evidence that justified them asking for that funding to be allocated in the first place? Therefore, what is their baseline against which they're prepared to be measured? And when, at what point, will they then step in to actually undertake some sort of evaluation against that baseline? Now, that baseline is based on the current expectations of the economy that we know about at the moment. And as Stephen has pointed out, in 2007, nobody, or virtually nobody, predicted the downturn that we're facing. So it's legitimate that you then recalibrate, but at least you've asked the responsible officer, what was the evidence you were basing your justification for your spending? What's the timescale within which you think you will have delivered? And at that point, what's your evaluation report looking like that says it did or it didn't deliver? It did deliver because of interventions, it didn't deliver because of external factors, and therefore there's a justification for either further funding or possibly you've delivered your targets and you can stop funding and use it for elsewhere.
Okay, John, to be followed by Jeremy.
Yeah, I mean, one of the lines in your paper said what is less clear is the relative importance of each of the chosen targets, and you're talking about that just now, and you're also saying we need to have a long-term view. But when if the budget tightens up from one year to another, how do we keep that long-term view? Because, I mean, housing's been mentioned a couple of times. I totally agree we should be putting money into housing. Yeah. Should culture suffer, therefore, in the short term? But on the other hand, culture in the long term is probably a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I as the Economist, then say pass it back to the politicians that is clearly a political decision at that point. Yes, so that's a legitimate political decision to be made balance one against the other. But if you're asking the economist to say, where am I getting best bangs for my buck, you have to think through, well, what is the longer term effect? And so there are some, I mean, there have been some statements made that, you know, short-term interventions have helped. They may have helped short-term employment effects. They may not have helped longer-term economic growth effects. Now, it's legitimate to have short-term employment impact, legitimate to have short-term interventions. But I think it's also legitimate to say you've done it potentially at the risk of affecting longer-term economic growth effects, because perhaps you have reduced culture as a consequence.
So, I mean, would you go as far as you know, kind of putting numbers against the chosen targets, like I think somebody suggested 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 or something like that, or is the danger of that is it becomes too fixed and we lose the judgment side?
I fear you would be losing the judgment. I think it is, at the end of the day, you've got a budget and it's a political decision where that budget goes. If you're then asking where's the best use of that funding given those priorities, then you've got an economist answer, and that's legitimate. But if you're saying I've now got a fundamentally different view because my budget's different and the world's different, then you have to reset your priorities. Having reset your priorities, then it's legitimate again to ask the economist, okay, given that, where should my money go?
Okay. Just before I let Jeremy in, I know that each time you use the example of taking money from somewhere to rent a house, it's old culture you mentioned, Jeremy, to be followed by Malcolm.
I'm sure that's just accidental coincidence.
Yes.
I think that, just picking up that last point, if I may, that I think that I totally agree with Joe that it is for government to set the priorities and within the context, and that context will change. But I think the more clarity there is over the government's priorities, the more that the economists and other analysts can actually help to determine whether those priorities are being met and how they could better be met. So I think clarity is always important, but it is for the politicians, based on their view of the will of the country, to form the priority list. And I do agree that one doesn't rank them in absolute terms or put numbers against them in that sense. But clarity is important. But I wanted to go back to this issue on how you evaluate, how you determine the success that has been achieved and lessons that could be learned. I just would like to link this perhaps to the issue of the independent fiscal institution that you're also considering in this committee at the moment. I think that there is great advantage from having an arm's length body appointed by and responsible to Parliament that can provide informed and independent advice and can develop a close relationship with the Parliament and its committees. And this doesn't have to be just for what the OBR does at the UK level. It can be for Scotland to choose what an independent fiscal institution might do and what its priorities might be. And I would suggest consideration as to whether periodic reports by a body like this on particular aspects of policy feeding into this committee and to other subject committees might be a very good way of evaluating based on the NPF, based on the policies set by government, and providing advice and analysis to Parliament and its committees, which could then help it to perform its challenge function against government at budget time and at other times. I'm a great believer in the importance of the strength of Parliament to perform that challenge function. And I think although you have great advice from Spice and elsewhere, I think there is a lack in Scotland of the type of well-resourced, arm's-length, objective, evidence-based input that we get from OBR and to an extent from the Institute of Fiscal Studies at the UK level. And having a body like a newly established independent fiscal institution which undertook this role amongst others and which was backed by the Parliament to make it better placed to carry out a rigorous evidence-based examination, I think that could really help in bridging the gap between the data provided by the NPF and the firm evaluation and therefore judgment on policies and on resource allocation which comes at the end of the day.
I'll come to you followed by Michael.
I found the CPPR paper very interesting. I thought, you know, the issue of trade-offs was something that could perhaps be looked at just in terms of analysing the whole performance framework. But what I wanted to really ask Joe about was the issue of what we measure. She emphasised the importance of productivity, but at the end of her paper she says there isn't a robust measure. So if she could say a bit more about the deficiencies of our current measure of productivity. But even more interesting, of course, is this issue about GDP and GNP. So my understanding is that there isn't a measurement of GNP. I don't know how easy that would be to achieve, and I mean, can you speculate on whether that would actually make quite a significant difference? It may even make a significant difference in the next few years, in the next few months, because obviously as part of our referendum debates, it's always GDP that's being quoted. So I just wonder about those points.
Yes, I will carefully use my words here. I think across certainly productivity and the economic growth target, whatever that might be, I think there are questions around what's the appropriate quality of data for Scotland. Certainly CPPR have been arguing for improved quality of data around those two measures for quite some time, so that's not new. I loathe to go into the space of GDP and GNP per capita in this forum, to be honest with you. Short-term measures are not something we're looking at. I think we've just got to be careful about we're using the right measure for the right reason. And if we're talking about increasing returns to individuals in Scotland, then a GNP measure is a more appropriate one probably than a GDP measure. But if we're using GDP as the measure over time, then showing improvement over time will be just as good. Maybe not the best, but just as good. So we have a measure and we can use it so long as we use it consistently and consistently measuring it in the same way, we're showing that change. The issue for me at the moment where we are with these data is that we haven't necessarily put a floor in these measures, and that's maybe a fairly techie issue, but it's one that is perhaps worthy of thinking through when we take the information off the National Performance Framework database. I think what's there is fantastic. I really do think it's extremely transparent. It's totally up to date, and I think the Finance Secretary is quite right. What more could he do? He couldn't do any more in terms of making it clear and transparent. It's not debated very much. For me, this is about the first time I've really had this level of debate around what's there, and it doesn't, to my mind, necessarily feed through to discussions in the Chamber, which is unfortunate. But what it's currently showing you at the moment is that certain measures are moving up and certain measures are moving down. But it doesn't say the movement up is actually because Scotland's not performing as bad as its comparator countries. And I don't think Scots or us would necessarily think that because we're not performing as bad as others, that's a good thing. Perhaps we also want to put a floor on some of these measures that say we don't want to fall below a certain level, and relative to our comparative nations or regions or whatever, we want to improve. So I think there's quite a bit we could do along what is already a very good basic tool to help improve the discussion around priorities and budget allocation.
Yes, I mean, I think, when it says things are improving, I've said this in the meetings that we've been having with the Cabinet Secretary, myself, people from other parties, that, if it says improving, is it by 0.1% or 20%? It's the scale of improvement or not. I think that's important. I think the issue on our GDP, GNP, I think is a really good one, particularly the per capita issue. But of course, the UK tends to just talk about GDP, even though, I mean, you could say the population of England's gone up, 1.5% a year. Therefore, if the economy's grown by 1.2%, there's actually a real term shrinkage of 0.3. So I think we have to use this a common measure in terms of this kind of argument.
I accept that, but I think if you were to look at Ireland and you were to look at, say, for example, Luxembourg, it's a GNP measure is a more appropriate one for the local population. So because we have an atypical kind of structure, you've got to think through the both are telling different things. So it's for different purposes. Yes.
Yes, indeed. Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I think trying to go on from this theme about whether we use GDP or GNP, and as Robert Black said, we can use heat targets, but who uses them and how do they use them? But I was interested in the comment of from the submission by Donald MacRae, in which he said we need to identify missing indicators. And I just wonder if we're into this territory of known unknowns or unknown unknowns. Do we know what indicators are out there that we need to use, or which ones that we're using that we don't need to use, which I think was what you were trying to say in terms of scrutiny, is that right?
To be honest, just before I let Donald in, I was like, Donald's the next section, so I'm just about to let Donald in, if that's okay, Michael. In a minute or two, I just want to... But Jean's asked to make a comment, and then we'll go to Donald.
But just really on the... I think 2 or 3 authors have referred to Scotland Performs and that it's recognised internationally, it's a good thing, but it needs to be promoted more and understood in Scotland. And I just wonder what, I mean, to what benefit, who needs to understand it better that would make it more efficient, or to what end?
Actually, Jean, funnily enough, after Donald, I was going to talk about raise the issue of public engagement, and just exactly that. So that's quite a pertinent point that you've actually raised. Certainly, Jeremy touched on it to some extent in his paper. But Donald, you've mentioned the issue of performance budgeting, so I'm just wondering if you can talk to us a wee bit about how NPF can better inform policy development and spending decisions. I'd be keen to hear from yourself, Bob, on that issue as well after Donald.
Well, thank you, Convener. My submission is targeted towards making better use of the National Performance Framework. It's partly on the way because it is, of course, based on outcomes as opposed to inputs or outputs, which I greatly welcome. It does purport to measure government performance overall. I think that's an important point. And to do that, it has no less than around 50 indicators. And the first point I want to make is that these indicators use numbers. Now, just a warning, numbers are only one way of expressing reality or describing reality. So just bear that in mind. I do suggest, though, that the numbers and the indicators should be validated annually by Audit Scotland. I then want to move the NPF from just measurement to what I've called performance budgeting, and that is linking the spending decisions to outcomes. Now, there's little evidence that I can see that that's happening at the moment, and I think it will be very hard to find evidence that, for example, an increase in expenditure in one area leads to an increase or decrease in a particular indicator. That's going to be almost impossible to produce. But I do think there are indirect linkages, and the question is, how do you encourage those indirect linkages? And I believe that one way of doing that would be to have referrals to indicators in all budget statements on expenditure, or in all budget statements there should be a referral to the relevant indicators to that piece of expenditure. Now, to do that, I think we are going to involve, or have to have, some degree of prioritisation. This has been discussed already. I would advocate an attachment of a rating scale to each indicator. Now, that's going to be challenging, but that's what governments have to do, actually, is decide priorities. And, of course, we should have, where possible, as many international comparisons on these as we can. On scrutiny, I would suggest that the Finance Committee should have an annual assessment of the National Performance Framework. And why do I say that, and why the Finance Committee? Well, actually, government expenditure is the ultimate expression of policy. It is the ultimate expression of policy. So that's why I suggest that the Finance Committee should particularly assess the performance framework. And that will involve taking a view on the thresholds that are in there for each indicator. It will involve taking a view on, are there any missing indicators? Now, I certainly have a view that perhaps there are some missing, perhaps there are too many. In fact, I would also suggest that the committee should seriously question, is this indicator the right one? Should it be in? Should we have more or less? And finally, come up with some assessment of how well the government is doing over all the indicators. But the most important part of my submission is about trying to improve the linkage between the spending decisions or the budget allocations and the indicators. And the only way I can think of doing that is to ask for a referral to the indicators, reference to the indicators in all budget statements.
Thank you. Bob.
There are 50 national indicators. Each one of them refers to a really important aspect of public life and welfare. And each one of them involves a whole range of systems and services to deliver them. Even something as simple as reducing road deaths or something contributes in all sorts of different ways. I would go part of the way with what Donald is saying about the need for a regular scrutiny. What I can't get my mind around is how, in practical terms, the Finance Committee, with its very busy agenda, can find the time to do that. And also there is an issue about the expertise to do it, to advise you. And for some time now, and some members of the committee may dimly recollect this, I kind of suggested that what the Parliament should usefully consider is actually, over the lifetime of a Parliament, deciding on a programme of maybe 5 or 6 major reviews of policy areas, let's say services for the elderly or whatever, and commission decent pieces of work which would take the national indicators as one of the inputs, but look at other sources of data, and actually come forward with reports for you on a managed timescale, which would be, to some extent, a development beyond the Audit Scotland reports. They would actually be looking at some of the policy issues as well, and bring those forward to you as an offering, which then can be used for scrutiny. So that over the lifetime of the Parliament, you might have one look at how the criminal justice system is working, one look at how services for the elderly are working, one look at the whole issue of child services and child poverty and so on. And otherwise the meal is just too big, it's indigestible. You've got to divide it up into bite-sized chunks. It's rather a big topic for today, but I do think I would strongly recommend that the Parliament think seriously about doing that. Otherwise, there's a risk we'll be constantly in a stuck conversation about we want more scrutiny every year, but it's just perhaps not practical to do it that way. So that would be one thought I would offer. Since I'm speaking, can I just come back to the very important issue of productivity? May I do that? Thank you very much. It's quite often useful to give examples. I'm back on my theme about looking outside the stovepipes and looking at whole systems. A number of years ago, Audit Scotland did a really interesting piece of work on orthopaedic services in Scotland. And there was good news and challenging news. The good news was that levels of measured activity did increase over best part of a several-year period. The less good news was that inputs, the number of orthopaedic surgeons and the spend, increased a lot more. So if you did the crude math, then you'd say productivity is falling. The health professionals said to us, yes, but the quality of what we do is changing. We're using surgeons in a different way. But it's very difficult to get to below that level. Whereas the real question to ask is, what we're trying to do here, we're trying to prolong the healthy life expectancy and quality of life of the elderly. Which services contribute to that? Where does orthopaedic surgery fit into that? How should it be appropriately resourced, given that if we improve falls clinics, we might have less need for orthopaedic surgeons, and if we improve the aftercare, then we might get the outcomes better. So it's really important that we move away from looking at issues too narrowly, and it's difficult for any committee of the Parliament to do that with the time and resources available, and therefore there is an issue about actually taking that to a body saying, would you look at that system for us and come back in a year's time, and we will programme into our work a serious examination of that policy area. And that would take the National Performance Framework, which is already a leading international exemplar, take it to a whole new level.
Thank you, Bob. Jamie, to follow by John.
Thank you, Vera. I certainly share Robert Black's perspective. It might be difficult for this committee to be looking at the National Performance Framework in its entirety on a regular basis, given the volume of work we have. But I want to return to the issue about that was raised in question by Michael McMahon and is in Don MacRae's paper about the need for further indicators. And I think Donald's kind of answered the question. He did go on to suggest that there may be a need to also look at whether some that are already set out are necessary. But it brings me back to Stephen Boyle's paper. I thought it was an interesting point that you made at the end of your paper, Stephen, that changes to indicators should be on a one-in, one-out basis. And I just wondered what other people felt about that as a suggestion.
Yes, I'll let you know that one, Donald, before.
Well, thanks, Convener. Obviously, I want to make the point that the framework should be considered to be dynamic. In other words, it is always possible to envisage new ones coming in, new indicators coming in, and crucially, taking Stephen's point, if one comes in, one has to go out. And, what is magic about 50? Could it be 40? Could it be 60? Yeah. Now there's going to be a huge temptation to always have more, and of course I have succumbed to that temptation by even suggesting too much myself. I haven't actually done the difficult part, which would be to say what two would I leave out. But I think the question should be seriously addressed, and it should be addressed on an annual basis, I believe. But it will always be a dynamic situation. Let me just give you one indicator I did notice. Increased physical activity. Well, I would suggest that I would replace that with one of my suggested indicators if I was forced into, But you will always get, I guess, competing views as to what indicators should be in and what should be out.
Thank you, John.
Well, I mean, just to pick up on that one, I mean, we actually had a witness last week who said that the single most important thing
she said it more than once
that could happen in health was to increase physical activity, and I think she would have dropped practically all the other health targets apart from that one. But anyway,
yes, she almost had us doing 20 pounds on the floor in front of you.
No, the point I was going to raise was, Mr. MacRae, you talked about referring to national indicators, I think, when maybe the Finance Secretary is presenting his budget or something. And I just wonder how that ties in with what Mr. Black just said about, not making things too narrow. That, I mean, if it's just a referral, that's very, very general. I mean, the Finance Secretary could say, well, we're going to spend more money on maths teachers. That's one of the indicators, and refers to it. But it still leaves totally open the question of measuring that, holding that to account. And I think yourself said sometimes it's impossible to say that a pound here does actually have that effect so far down the line. So how can we tie all that together?
Well, you're absolutely right to refer to the difficulty of the linkage. Just go back to the target or indicator of increased physical activity. Now, can anybody tell me what is the connection between particular government expenditure and that indicator? I find that particularly challenging. You have to accept that. Nevertheless, what I mean by referral to in budget statements is that if the referral is required in budget statements, say you're assessing or you're giving the budget for expenditure on economic development, for example, for the Scottish Enterprise budget, then I would fully expect to be reference to some indicators there, saying right they're too low or they need to be improved, or, and that forces the recognition that there has to be some acknowledgement that movement of spending will affect the indicator. And maybe it will also flash out the situations where there has been an increase in spend and there hasn't been any increase in performance. We'll have to flash out those areas as well. So that's the only way I can think of improving the linkage between budgeting and indicators or outcomes.
So can I ask, would you want to go as far as, like a prediction? So say we go back to the 3% increase in hospital admissions. Would you be looking, do you think we should be saying, well, that will reduce it to only a 1% increase, or it'll actually reduce it to be minus?
No, I
wouldn't go that far.
I would not recommend that. That's asking far too much.
But just that it would have an impact on that indicator.
Yeah.
Right, okay,
thanks. Malcolm, to follow by Jim.
I found that the suggestion about referrals to indicators extremely interesting. I think actually it could be very useful in thinking about the performance framework in general and the budget. I mean, I suppose one thing that occurs to me is, and I'm not clear about this, I mean, the relationship between the indicators and the purpose targets and the strategic objectives. So I'd be interested to know why you picked the indicators. I mean, I suppose one critique of the strategic objectives is that any activity could meet one of them because they are so general, and it may be a weakness of the strategic objectives. So there may be a great deal of sense in going for the indicators, but obviously you've already opened up an interesting discussion. And I suppose the other thing is, if you are going to do that, you have to get into the whole area of relative importance. I mean, one area that I'm interested in, as Jim, is poverty. I think there's only 2 related to that. So I suppose my sense is they're probably more important than some of the other ones. And I have to say, I agree that physical activity is probably a particularly important health one. So I'm disagreeing with you there. But I suppose the other interesting thing for us to do, if you're saying that every spending decision should be related to an indicator, I'm sure we could all think of major spending commitments that we cannot relate to any of those indicators. If I mention some, we'll immediately get into areas of controversy. But without giving a view on free education, free payment of tuition fees, of which, in fact, I've always supported anyway, but we know there's a debate about that. There's none of those indicators, as far as I can see, have any relevance to that. And I'm sure we could all think of other examples. So people may draw a certain conclusion from that, which I'm not drawing, but I think it's a really interesting suggestion. It would bear fruit in terms of our consideration of the budget.
Can I just make one point? I mean, the subject of prioritisation has been raised, and some have questioned, my idea of attaching a sort of rating, if you like. But if you don't do that, what do you end up with? 50 indicators, and we have to see them all going up at the same time. Well, I mean, I find that challenging to accept as a concept that would actually work. Because you have to recognise there are some indicators which movement upwards or in a beneficial way is going to be harder to achieve than others, and there's going to be some competition, in fact, between some of the indicators. You have to recognise that.
Okay, Jim?
A couple of reflections if I'm making, when you do a bit of digging and under the surface, one thing I thought was quite interesting was when you look at the 16 national outcomes and you look at which indicators are related to them, there's quite an interesting variation. So one outcome has only 3 indicators related to it, another has 18 related to it. So there's an element in which my sense is that the relationship between the outcomes and indicators is a bit random, frankly, and that a case could be made for doing it quite differently. And I'd like to see those linkages being a clearer narrative about the linkages, and which might be considered as headline indicators for delivery of particular outcomes versus others that might be important but aren't headlines. But just to reflect on a couple of points made by committee members, Jimmy Hepburn had asked about do we add to the indicators, do we change them? One example I would give is that when the policy agenda changes, we have to ask the question, how does the framework adapt? And the example I've got is, in this year's guidance to community planning partners around the priorities for the single outcome agreements, the first new priority is on economic recovery and growth. Interesting phrase, recovery, I think, because that might suggest the purpose target on labour markets would be about getting back to the level of labour market participation just before recession. There might be something to pick up Joe's point about absolute performance, not just relative to England and Wales and Northern Ireland, but absolute performance. That might be a worthy addition to the suite of measures, so that we know are we getting back on track following the massive impact of recession. And just a second point to relate to something John Mason raised, a really important point, kind of about externalities. John, you raised the point. Would things have been worse if we hadn't made some interventions, even though it looks like we're going in the wrong direction? It's a really important point. And the example I would give in the Scottish Government's programme is around fuel poverty. That's a programme which has a high quality evaluation, and we know the difference it makes. It makes a positive net difference. But if you look at figures in fuel poverty, they went substantially in the wrong direction. And the answer to that conundrum is things would have been much, much worse without the Scottish Government's programme. So should we be looking at doing those programmes that work on a much bigger scale to mitigate the impact of externalities, in this case, fuel prices, UK reforms around tax and so on. So the point that the framework will tell us something in terms of numbers is right, but we should be careful about how we interpret some of these trends, because the story on what government is doing might be a good one, but the outcome may still be negative.
Thank you. Joe?
Yeah, I think what Jim has just alluded to, I think is really important. For me, 50 targets, it seems extraordinarily hard, as Donald says, to be able to say they're all got to move up and they've all got to move up at the same time. They just will not, that just will not happen. Dare I say it, that the level 4 spend has driven what the targets are. You know, having allocated funding, we've then found targets to make sure that that funding is justified. Maybe that's a bit unfair, but there's probably an element of that in it. If we are seeing fundamentally the world has changed because we've now got a harder economic environment in which we're going to have to work with less money, the headline target, the headline purpose is still the same. The overarching outcomes that we're seeking to achieve probably still roughly the same. What we do underneath it, I think we've got to be careful about being so prescriptive we actually end up perversely allocating funds in the wrong direction. And I'm minded to, and it's partially relevant, but it might be a useful one to think about. I'm minded to think about the Water Commission. When it started out, when Ofwat set out, it set up massive numbers of targets for this beast to become more efficient. As it got more comfortable with what it's trying to achieve, its headline target was still the same: effective water at quality that's set by EU standards. How you then deliver that was then much, much more in the hands of those who are actually responsible for allocating the funding. As we get more comfortable with our headline purpose being what we actually are about, that we are much more comfortable about, yes, those relatively high-level outcomes are seeking to achieve. How we then allocate the budgets probably is a departmental decision or a quango decision that we just allow them to get on with it in the expectation that they will deliver and will be influencing the delivery of those higher level purpose and outcome targets. But they're not short-term measures. So short-term interventions will be for short-term expedient purposes. The longer-term budget allocations must be to deliver the longer-term higher level purposes and outcomes, and therefore 50 seems to me extraordinarily hard to justify, to monitor and to use effectively for allocating large chunks of public funding.
What kind of number would you be?
Well, I mean, you know, I mean, 4 high level or 7 high level objectives are quite hard to actually manage and monitor effectively and realistically. So, I mean, if you get real comfort that those are the right ones, and again, what we did back in 2008 was we liked the idea of setting these high-level targets. We weren't convinced they're necessarily the right ones. I think there's definitely justification for saying, are they the right level? Because if we are the right ones, if they are the right ones, then we're comfortable that the data we've got we can use to monitor, and we monitor them over a long-term, not short-term movements. And then it's up to the departments to decide how they're going to allocate their funding, in the expectation at some point within a budget cycle, within a spending review cycle, they'll be monitored against the delivery of those targets.
Now I'm going to move on to the issue which Jean actually raised. I mean, in your paper, Jeremy, in paragraph 13, you said, while Scotland Performs is an excellent online resource which brings together most up-to-date information available on how Scotland's performing, and unless people are aware of its existence, it will not fulfil its potential.
I think that I was frankly surprised when I started looking at the MPF as to how much very valuable work there is there and how much very valuable information is available. And surprised that I wasn't more aware of it, which is in part clearly my fault and responsibility, but to me implied that it wasn't being used as much in aiding decision-making in the Parliament and elsewhere as it should have been. So I think there is a case for getting it better known. I think that's extremely difficult, though, because it's not exactly the most sexy topic to try and get across. Asking the BBC to have a series of programmes on the NPF or Radio 4 or wherever may not be a winner. but I think there is a need for bringing to policy discussions and resource allocation discussions the fact of the existence of the MPF and the results that are emerging from it, the analysis that is in there, so that it is known throughout, it is known better to those interested in decision making that this is a part of the process. And it's not just sitting there ignored, it is actually being used to inform and assist decision making. So I think that's why I like the idea in one of the papers here, well, it's in Donald's last point, what he says is his last point, that linking the NPF indicators to the annual budgeting process and the budget statement, I think that is important. I think it should be much more upfront that the NPF exists and is being used. And if that continues to happen, then it may be reported, more people may be aware of it. And that, in turn, would lead to, I think, better decision-making as people became aware of what is there and the implications of what is there and started to see how it could be improved and what conclusions they drew from the data for their priorities and compared that with the way that decisions are being taken. So I think getting it more in the public eye is desirable. Donald's suggestion is the best I've seen of how to start that process, but it's not going to be easy or straightforward. A PR exercise for the MPF is not one that I would particularly like to take a commission for.
I mean, this actually is something which the cross-party group looking at the NPF with the Cabinet Secretary is actually mulling over actually how we engage and raise the profile of it so that people do feel it's something they know more about and are more happy to engage with. Malcolm.
I don't take quite such a pessimistic view of the potential public interest in this, because I think if you just look at the brief discussion we've had of the national indicators, I think you'd actually have quite a good discussion with the focus group about the relative importance, I think, of those national indicators, and they might well come up with some other ones that they think are more important. So I think through the indicators it actually could be quite accessible and quite interesting for people.
Okay. Now, I've not got anyone else who's indicated that they want to speak, so what I would like to do is to ask each of our guests in turn if there's any final points that they would wish to make before we wind up this session of the committee. Who's my first volunteer? Bob, I thought it'd be you.
A relatively specific point, but I think it's an important one. Joe mentioned this a little while ago during the discussion about which extra indicators. I'm not going to go into the bear pit of suggesting which indicators should be omitted, but it struck me for a number of years actually as rather surprising that there's so little about housing in the framework. I won't say much more than that, but it does seem to me, as I'm sure we'd all recognise, there are such major issues around in terms of the future direction of housing policy and housing stock in Scotland. It's such a fundamental issue in terms of public health, welfare and well-being that it might be an issue that's worth revisiting. How's it happened? I think, well, I mean, the housing market, the housing scene has been transformed during my professional lifetime in terms of tenure mix and all of that stuff. And then in terms of housing delivery, now the public housing is much more focused on the housing association movement than a local government. And that kind of has pushed the subject slightly to the side of what I would call the main departmental interests. But it's such an important issue for the well-being of Scotland that it may well be an area that merits a rethink.
Okay. Anyone else want to contribute on any aspect of what we've discussed today, or even if we've something that we've actually missed? Joe.
Yeah, I'd like to see this as an opportunity to refresh the high-level indicators, principally because if we are talking about periods of severe budget constraint, the decision-making process around budget allocations are quite different to what they were in the last 10 years. And having some of those targets, clearly identifying where priorities might lie, I think it's probably now is a good time as any to start that process.
Okay. Jim, to follow with Jeremy.
If there's one thing I think that would help in the next year, it would be to tie together the National Performance Framework with this document, which is the guidance to community planning partnerships, in particular the 6 priority policy areas which every bit of Scotland is supposed to be delivering on. I think if we marshalled the evidence, the linkages, the evaluation evidence better across those 6 priority themes, we would be doing the whole of the public realm in Scotland a service. I think it would improve ownership, to pick up Jean's point as well, at the local level. And the more specific point about indicators, to me this underplays the importance of the education attainment gap within Scotland. So our top 20% in Scotland of school children are performing at the level of Hong Kong or Singapore. The bottom 20% are performing at the level of Turkey. And closing that attainment gap has consequences for lots of other indicators. And what we're doing within this framework is too high level and too generic to capture the importance of closing that gap.
Thank you. Jeremy, to follow Donald.
I just wanted, if I may, to try and draw 3 or 4 threads together. Is that, first of all, thank you very much for permitting us to have this session, which I found extremely constructive, and I think you'll all have realised that we came to praise the NPF, and any comments have been made within that general context, and also accepting how difficult this whole process is. But I think 3 or 4 things have come out to me from the discussion. One is that any improvements will be at the margin, but there can be improvements. I think this issue of better comparators, what are the best comparators, and also taking account of what would have happened without action, the counterfactual point that John Mason made, how one brings that in. Add a few, take away a few. I very much agree with Donald that we should get something on business investment, and business investment in R&D preferably, actually, is something that I think is sadly missing. And I think, but yes, we shouldn't be adding on, one should be taking it at the same time. I think the point of vetting the data has been made, and I think merits your attention. And I think that also some form of re-examination of the link between the indicators and the objectives, it may well be desired, but I think it's all at the margin. I think we've had a good discussion on the prioritisation and how far one goes on that. And I have a lot of sympathy again with what Donald said just now, which is that one can't just leave them all as equal. One has to make some attempt to give a degree of ranking, not quantifying the extent that you give 2% here and 50% there, but just giving indications of orders of priority, if you like. I think we've also had the discussion of how to take the outcome of the performance framework to use to further inform decision making, and Bob's given the ideas of taking a number of topics during the course of a parliament and investigating those in depth. I've given the suggestion of linking it potentially to the IFI. The same really story, which is you're taking an informed, objective, arm's-length group and using that to look in detail at a select group. You can't do it all, but if you take them in turn, over time you get a much better grasp, and that must aid decision-making. And I think that brings to the last point I had here, which is this link to resource allocation and policy decision-making, which I think in virtually every paper we've said is the area where development is most needed. But I think we all think that because this process, the NPF is so valuable, the potential of using it is great. It's not easy, it's not a mechanistic process, but it is important that in some selective and periodic way, policy areas are examined, resource allocation between policy areas is examined on the basis of the information in the NPF and further evidence-based analysis. So I think there are pointers for where you go. This is all heading in the right direction. It's all very valuable. It's not easy, but I think it's to me been very constructive to be involved in the process, because what had been a sort of glimmer at the back of my consciousness has become much further up front, as it should have been, and I realise the value that has been extracted and the further value that could be extracted going forward.
Thank you, Jeremy. And Donald, to be followed.
Very quick point, Chairman. Remember that the NPF is measurement of government. Now, just remember that the Scottish Government has not got the full ability to influence all of the indicators which are currently in the NPF. I mean, just remember that. it may be quite right to have some indicators in, like, I don't know, GDP growth, but the Scottish Government cannot prevent an international recession. it clearly also has a limited powers in relation to the current political settlement. So just remember that it is a measurement of government, but remember it's a measurement of government with limited powers to influence the outcomes.
So I think some of us are very acutely aware of that. And the last word is with you, Stephen.
Thank you, Convener. Maybe back to where Jim McCormick started. This is a real asset for Scotland. I think it's something we should be pleased and proud of without being complacent about it. So, in that context, don't ask the framework to do too much. It's a measurement framework. It's not a substitute for judgment or matters of principle. I would resist strongly the temptation to tinker with it too much. It's very easy to measure more things, so I would resist that. I would resist the temptation to go for ever more amounts of data. My personal preference would be, as I said earlier, to go for more evaluation rather than just for more measurement. And I will abuse my position as being the last person to speak among your guests to say that if I was to make one change to it, I would take out any one of the economic indicators and replace it with a measure of median household disposable income. Because the productivity point's important, but what we know across the Western world is that economies can grow, average incomes can rise, and most people don't get better off. So I would have that in there.
Thank you very much for that. I'd like to thank everyone for their contributions, very positive contributions this morning. Very much appreciated by the committee. Now that ends the public section of the committee's deliberations today, so I'm now going to close the public section of today's session and call a break for members, so they can have a natural break before we start back in 6 or 7 minutes. Okay, thank you everyone.